Hello and welcome back to Eye on Iowa. I'm Sarah Muller, a reporter with Forbes, and today I'm sitting down with Dr. Kelly Winfrey at the Iowa State University's journalism school. There's a lot going on with advertising, and that's why I asked you to sit down today because like I told you before we got this started, I have a friend from out of town who came in and said, I forgot how bad the advertising is, the political advertising is when you come and watch TV here. It's like back to back ads. So, just to get us started, will you tell some of our viewers who maybe don't know the environment here in Iowa what the advertising is like here?
It is very different than a lot of other states, especially at this point in the election cycle. A lot of the other rest of the country is not thinking too much yet about politics, but we are getting ads from, the candidates you've heard of, DeSantis, Scott, and some candidates that folks in other parts of the country probably haven't heard of at all. Burgum, Ramaswamy, heard are advertising here. And I'll say I watch the local news in the morning and I watch some of the national morning shows, and I'm seeing ads, every commercial break, there's at least one, usually multiple political ads. So yeah, it's in regular rotation here. For someone like me that studies it, I love it. But yeah, for most folks, it gets a little old, especially since we're so far out from the caucuses.
Dr. Winfrey, I used to work in local news, and I remember we would have a countdown almost of when the last advertisement would run on our station. So just to start us off, what do you think is the effectiveness of these ads for voters? I mean, is it just for brand awareness? Is it just for candidate awareness, or do you think they're actually making an impact with what they're talking about?
So research on political advertising is pretty conclusive that it helps candidates, that it is successful in increasing the name identification of candidates and helping to establish a candidate's positive image, and then also in conveying information, whether it be about issues or attacking opponents. In this race right now, I think there are kind of two main things happening. One is name identification. Making sure that caucus goers know the names of all of the candidates and have a favorable opinion of them. And then the second part is to try to get enough in the polls to be in the debates and also to take on Trump in some way. So in addition to the candidate-sponsored ads, we have a lot of political action committees running ads on behalf of candidates, but also attacking Trump in an attempt to decrease his numbers as well. And what research tells us is these tend to be pretty effective strategies. So we'll see how things turn out with this one.
You said you'd watched a couple of the advertisements that are hitting the airwaves right now. I want to know what has stood out to you. One that kind of I think of, it was the Super Bowl ad by Perry Johnson, Republican candidate, who it was kind of a Perry who question and then talking about inflation, and it had these blow up versions of each of the people in Washington who are making predominant decisions. That one always stands out to me. What has caught your eye?
I think really what's caught my eye are the number of PAC sponsored ads that are anti-Trump. That's not something we usually see in a primary race. We sometimes see attacks, but to have PACs that are dedicated to attacking one candidate and not endorsing any other particular candidate is pretty unique. I think some of the strategies that they are using in those ads is also interesting to most of the ones that I've seen, excuse me, like from Win It Backpack, have featured usually a white male who had voted for Trump in previous elections, saying that they're not going to vote for him this time because they don't think he can win the general election. So that's just a unique, partially unique because it's not that many times we've had a former president who lost a second term running again, but also kind of the polarization around Trump and a party that's maybe trying to break away from him. So that's certainly unique. And I think most of what I've seen though from the candidates themselves have been pretty typical. A lot of the candidate looking at the camera saying, here's who I am. You know, a lot of Tim Scott ads. I'm Tim Scott. Here's what issues I care about. Here's why I think I can beat Biden in a general election. That's run of the mill, you know, what you would expect to see in a primary race.
I've definitely seen the ads that you're talking about, specifically the ones asking people to consider a different GOP nominee than Trump. Now, from your opinion, have you seen any attack ads? Because I feel like I haven't seen any specific attack ads at this point in the race. It's almost like there's too many candidates to pick one to attack, given that Trump is polling high. We also have DeSantis, who's kind of going down in the polls. Vivek was doing very well after the last debate. Have you seen any attack ads in the last few months?
You know, so the PAC ads attacking Trump, most of the candidates have stayed away from making attacks. Trump, and I think more specifically, the MAGA Inc. PAC that's associated with him, has ran some ads attacking DeSantis. I think most of those have been more national cable ad buys that we're seeing in Iowa, but folks are probably seeing elsewhere. But that's really the only ones that I have seen. And I'll say that's, you know, that's pretty typical. A lot of times in primary races, you don't want to go too hard attacking your own party because if they end up being the candidate, then you're giving ammunition to the opposing party come time for the general election cycle. So a lot of what you'll see in, you know, what's typical in primary ads is, you know, the biographical information and some issues and talking about the ability to win in a general election.
Now let's talk about some of the dollars behind this. As I said, I worked in local news, and these advertisements would help pay for salaries for a couple of years. I mean, there's a lot of money here. Can you talk about some of the numbers?
Yeah, so I was looking yesterday, and one of the most recent numbers I've seen in terms of ad spending in Iowa was about $39 million already spent in advertising in Iowa. And the numbers range a lot. Tim Scott has been the biggest spender between him, his campaign and the PAC that's associated with him. They've spent about $22 million in ad buys in Iowa. Now, some of those are bought all the way into January of 2024, so we haven't seen all of the ads that money's purchased. But that's a huge number. And he's sitting at about 9% in the last Iowa poll. DeSantis has spent about $5.5 million, and he's got about 19% of the vote in the last Iowa poll. But overall, you know, multi-million-dollar ad campaigns this early, and I think it's noteworthy because at this time in 2019, when we still had a few Democrats in the field, not a few, we had a lot of Democrats in the field. Still, and they were only around a couple $1 million in ad buys. So this is very different than what we saw 4 years ago with the Democrats.
Now I'm curious, we just had Mayor Francis Suarez drop out of the race this week. When you talk about buying advertisements through a certain date, does that maybe impact, you know, when people are going to drop out? Because there's still a lot of time till January. I mean, we could have quite a few candidates drop before the caucus. And I just wonder, you know, if that money's spent, or can they withdraw those ads? How does that work?
Well, that's a good question. You know, I think it shows that they are planning to stick around. And if anything, that can help with fundraising and showing that they're a serious candidate, that they're willing to commit that far in advance. You know, I think Scott's the only candidate that's bought into 2024 that I've seen any numbers on anyway. And so, you know, it shows that he's in it for at least pretty much the long haul. That gets you pretty close to the caucuses. You know, if the money runs dry, though, in other areas that might, you know, a candidate still might have to back out. There's a lot of other expenses associated with campaigning. So whether or not they have the funds to keep campaigning and doing all of the other things, traveling around the state, being viable, not just in Iowa, but looking at New Hampshire as well. You know, any big missteps that could still impact whether a candidate pulls out. But I would guess that the biggest spenders are probably going to stick around. particularly those that are garnering, more than 5% of the vote in the Iowa poll now, I would expect would stick around through the caucuses, because you also have to think about not just, Iowa, but how can they do in New Hampshire, South Carolina, and are they a potential VP candidate?
So what are some things that you think that Iowans specifically, or, people from New Hampshire, some of these upcoming early states should look for in these advertisements while they're vetting these candidates? I mean, the candidates are popping up everywhere, but specifically when people are sitting in their living rooms, what do you think that they should look for in these ads?
Well, I always say with advertising, take everything with a grain of salt, because it's meant to persuade you. They should be truthful. So that's, something that you should look for, that things are factual. I think it's always good if you hear a outlandish claim to do a quick Google search or two and fact check. And there are different organizations like AdWatch that monitor advertising, and the Wesleyan Media Project that talk about what content, and also do some fact checking. So that's always good. But I think, as you're looking at the candidates in advertising, and also kind of coupling that with how they're doing in debates or how they've seen in interviews, if you're looking for the best candidate, is it somebody that can win the general election? I think that's the biggest question. And I think that's, Trump's biggest weakness, is whether or not he can beat Biden in a second go, especially with all of the legal things that he's going through right now. So which candidates can win in a national election? The big thing right now, I think, is despite Trump not spending that much money in Iowa, that he's still got over 40% of the voters saying they plan to caucus for him. So finding someone that can beat him and consolidating candidates, I think, is probably what the other opponent, what his opponents are looking for. And I'd look for candidates that are talking about the issues that matter to you, and are talking about them in a way that will appeal to a broader audience. I think, in Iowa, we're so spoiled because, well, spoiled or tortured, depending on how you look at it, because we see so much of the candidates between advertising and, in-person events. Everybody was at the state fair. All of the information that we get more than a lot of people do. So as you think not just about what we want in Iowa, but what is going to work nationally, what's going to have national appeal, I think it's a strategic way to use your vote if you're planning to caucus, particularly on the Republican side.
I want to divert for our last question to polling. I'm curious, from your point of view, how do you think the polling is different in this election versus previous elections, when maybe we, for example, 2016, when people thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and obviously Trump came out on top, and people questioned the polling methods as being a proper sample of how people were going to vote. How do you think that's translating into this election, given that Trump is polling ahead, all of his legal battles that he's had, all of the controversies that have surrounded him, and then you have people like DeSantis, who is just fluctuating tremendously? How do you think it is different this year versus previous years?
Well, I think, one of the big differences is the Trump factor, right? A former president who lost a second term, and has a lot of support still. That's just a factor that is unlike a lot of previous elections. And I think that you can assume that his support is pretty strong at this point. If people are still hanging with him, then they're probably pretty committed. So there may be the opportunity for some movement. But I think when you look at polling, it's always good to look at the specifics of the poll. State polls, like if you're looking at how candidates are doing in Iowa, that's pretty indicative of how they're going to do in the Iowa caucus. Now, that's still months away, so things can move, but you're looking at the people who are making the decision. National polls are tricky because we don't elect our president based on general, popular vote. So just because someone has 60% of support, in a national poll, doesn't mean that they're going to win the election, because what really matters are the state by state results and how the electoral college plays out. So what I would pay the most attention to really are those state polls, and particularly in terms of the caucuses and primaries, looking at the early states to see who's likely to sustain funding. And then also, looking at polling in states that might be purple states, swing states, places like Michigan or Georgia, places like that that could, turn a general election. Which way is that heading? But always take polling with a grain of salt. Look at the specifics of where the poll was, who was polled, what the margin of error is, and know that this far out, it is still a guess, right? A year before an election, especially thinking about general election candidates, who knows? In 2008, I was researching candidates, and everybody thought that it was going to be Rudy Giuliani and Hillary Clinton. At this point, that far out, and obviously that's not what happened at all in 2008. So take it with a grain of salt, make your own decisions, but keep in mind the specifics of the poll.
Well, Dr. Winfrey, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.